So I want to take you, if you like, down from the lofty heights of international politics and vendor relations back to the more prosaic world of how a retail service provider sees the next 10 years in an NBN environment here in Australia in particular. So by way of background in the NBNs, we appreciate there are challenges in building it. This doesn't happen to be, despite what I just said, this is not an Australian picture. This was taken by a mate of mine in Vietnam not very long ago. And it clearly indicates that people doing overhead cabling have some challenges in terms of laying that cable. In some countries, the council approvals are clearly a bit easier to gain. Back in again to Australia, something I want to just start off with mentioning to you all, just think back to the original announcement of the NBN and think of the rhetoric that we heard from the government when it was announced. When it was announced, it was very, very clearly a GFC recovery policy. There were some words used then that I challenge you to find used by federal politicians ever since, about it being bigger than the Snowy Mountain scheme, about it employing 35,000 happy, hopefully Australian labourers to actually build the thing. Though that rhetoric and those words, for me, although it was never directly stated, built a sense for me of it being a subsidised network, in the same sense as building a road system nationally, the government building it and us all getting to use it, and the returns being allowed to be the relatively indirect and obvious returns of any sort of road system, about economic benefit indirectly downstream. But what's changed since the GFC went away is now it's very much a commercial investment network. What I mean is the expectation, and this drives NBN Co's pricing model, it therefore drives our pricing model, which is part of the answer to the question, why do you still pay for downloads? Our model is driven by the NBN model, which in turn is driven by the necessary requirement to get a commercial return on investment, albeit at a utility rate from the network. There's nothing bad about that statement, but you need to understand that consumers will pay to build this network, and they will pay through a chain, retail service providers through NBN, through to paying people to actually build the thing. Now we have this clear challenge in the network. It's a pity that Malcolm Turnbull couldn't join us this morning. I certainly look forward to it. Clearly there's this obvious elephant in the room about sovereign risk in the network, and that's stating the bleeding obvious. It's also a brave man that would predict exactly what politics will look like over the next 2 years. I mean, who knows who's going to be leading the country by then? It could be Back to the Future, it could be forward to some other future. You know, it's a surprising space. So that permeates everything about the network. We're all kind of living in this dual future, at least in principle, about what happens in roughly 2 years' time. Last time I stood in front of an audience at a ComStay event, I think back in April in Sydney, I was focused on the NBN Co part of the economic puzzle for a retail service provider like us. So what impact does the NBN cost model have on us? And I spent a while at the time explaining some very large economic challenges in the NBN Co price model in a bootstrapping sense. And much to I suggest some industry members' astonishment, they listened to me. And they didn't just listen to me, they listened to other people. I hope at least I had a catalytic role in the process of helping NBN Co make some key changes to their pricing model that are actually in the long term cost neutral with them, but which increase retail service provider participation, and that's clearly a good thing. Given that that has happened, all of us in the world live with a hierarchy of needs, right? We live with the notion that if you solve the largest problem in the room, what you're left with is the next largest and the next largest. And in that respect, I want to talk to you about, from my perspective, 3 remaining elephants in the room in the life of a retail service provider who is trying to make a living and still be around over the next 10 years and clearly intends to do both things. So that's the substance of what I want to talk to you about today, is 3 elephants in the room and what they mean to me as a retail service provider. Now, when you evaluate these, you all come from different parts of the industry. You won't necessarily agree with me, but what I'd ask you to do is see it through my lens for a little while and see whether at least some of what I'm saying makes sense to you. Let's talk about the first elephant in the room, which is 121 points of interconnect that Mike quickly mentioned in his talk, and mentioned them as if they're a fait accompli that's somehow irreversible. But those of us who've been around for more than 5 years appreciate that nothing in politics or regulation is ever truly irreversible if you're committed enough to beavering away at something that's entirely silly. From my point of view, unless you're Telstra, 121 points of interconnect is a bad thing. I will actually face you with some words for one slide out of many, just to kind of prove the point about this. But here are just some of the things that are bad for a retail service provider about 121 points of interconnect. They're kind of obvious, but they're worth touching on. all the overheads to attach the network rise. So instead of 14x, I'm facing 121x, whatever x is. NBN Co have done their part to reduce x, but I've still got to get to those places. It's another rather interesting and annoying thing. NBN Co are building beautiful rings around the country. There are 2 network links to Tasmania in the diagram Mike put up, but can I use them or not? When these POIs are distributed from 14 to 121, it arguably reduces the reliability of the network to failure, to major failure of a point of interconnect. Those of us who watch the news for the last few years will appreciate you get natural disasters in strange places. Things get flooded, burned down, get run over by elephants. All sorts of things go wrong. The original design of the NBN had pairs of dual redundant POPs in major areas, four of them in Sydney for New South Wales, but in a broad sense, dual redundant POP pairs. We as the industry would attach to those pairs. If there was a major failure at one of those points of interconnect, everything could switch over to the other. Now the country's been cut into 121 slices. If there's a major failure at one of those slices, there are a number of scenarios under which that part of the network will go down until that place is rebuilt or repatched. The other thing to bear in mind is we can expect more than, we can expect a number of mobile service providers to want to use the NBN as a very economic form of backhaul. When they do that and the NBN fails, think about what happened to the backup in your pocket. It may fail with it. The deep thing in a lot of ways for someone like me who cares a lot about regional equity is the fact that by pushing these points of interconnect deeper out into regional areas, you are necessarily creating a cost disparity in the financial chain for a retail service provider, so that it costs more for us to service the bush than the city. When the network was originally drawn up, that was not the intention, and the aggregation of usage meant that everyone would pay the same price. The government have said accurately that they didn't quite guarantee a uniform retail price, they guaranteed a uniform wholesale price. That's true, but you have to get there from here. And that cost to get to regional areas, because it's larger, means that we are at significant risk of seeing either a price disparity, bush costing more than the city, yet again, or reduced participation in the bush. No provider in the world we expect to see in the next 10 years can just average this stuff out. If you want to win in the city, if you want to survive what will become a brutally cost-based game, you can't just squeeze that cost out and expect it to go away. Then there's the fact that these points of interconnect, except for the ones back in capital cities, are owned and operated by Telstra. They're in Telstra buildings. The only fibre that goes to all of them is Telstra fibre. NBN Co have a deal to lease dark fibre to those places. No one else does. So it can be expensive to reach some of those places. Although it's not directly a consequence of this, it's worth understanding as well that Telstra have an 11 billion tax-exclusive net present value war chest to be paid to turn the copper off. Importantly, and I'll come back to this, they're not being paid to sell it to NBN Co, they're just being paid as a farmer to stop using that thing to grow crops. They still own that copper, and that's actually really, really important, and in my view, a mistake. As I said, the cost to reach those POIs is also additional to NBN Co costs. So all the wholesale costs the industry pays to use the NBN, to use Mike Quigley's tail circuits, there's this additional cost to reach these POIs, to pay for that access path, however you do that. So higher overheads for everyone except Telstra. One other interesting point is the Telstra shareholder vote that's coming up next week. The economic information that Telstra supplied to shareholders says that they believe that Telstra are $4.7 billion more valuable for doing the deal than not doing the deal. That's what their economic advice says in the shareholder briefing pack. In my view, arguably that indicates that NBN Co are actually overpaying to do what they're doing. There's a $5 billion sweetener to play nicely. It's an awful lot of money. I also wasn't, well, something also wasn't lost on me was the irony. Have we seen 4.7 billion before, those of us who've been here a while? It's a spooky number, isn't it? Remember that number? It goes all the way back to Howard and Trujillo when the first shot at organised blackmail for building these networks. So let's get to that second elephant in the room, which is the notion of leaving Telstra actually owning that copper in the ground during and after the network build of this network. This, I put to you, is actually a problem, and I'll explain why it's a problem. To do so involves doing something that may look kind of backward-looking, since I'm very much a proponent of fibre networks, but let's talk about what it actually means. It actually means something really interesting about the potential for a future government, and I don't mean a coalition government, I mean any future government, including the current one, in a re-elected form. Imagine that there is another serious GFC, another serious recession. And a government of either persuasion needs to chop half the cost out of this network in order to survive the build of it, in order to get it to all of us. The economically pragmatic way to do that is to convert some of the network back to fibre to the node, to use VDSL. That's the technical answer if for whatever reason you've got to save some money in building the network. To do that requires something obvious. To cut the copper halfway, put cabinets down in the street. Where the current fibre split cabinets are, you've got to cut the copper, re-terminate it to those cabinets. We've all been here before, we know how this works. But here's the point, you can't compel Telstra to do that. You've paid them to turn the copper off. You have not gained the right to cut it in two. Telstra still own it. This is arguably what sunk the previous fibre to the node era in Australia, ironically, was that no tenderer except Telstra could cut the copper in order to build the network. And in a tender where only one person can win, it's not a tender, it's a negotiation, except the negotiation is with someone with extremely high market power. So there's this deep mistake, in my view, in the NBN Co-Telstra deal about not actually buying the asset that you're just about to pay for. Seems like rather a strange decision. So this is the point. The NBN Co deal leaves the copper owned by Telstra. There's law, including constitutional law, that establishes it pretty clearly. It's still their property. When you cut it in two, it's like cutting the top half off a high-rise building and expecting the owner to be happy with being left with the bottom half. You've got to buy the whole building before you mutilate it. You've got to buy the whole building before you cut it in two. So it's a real pity that that isn't embedded in the current deal. We've established what the copper's worth. If they're never going to turn it on again, that's what the price of the copper is. So why on earth didn't they buy it? Third element in the room is the Telstra structural separation undertaking. And from my point of view, and bear in mind it's my personal view here, albeit informed by people that are probably smarter than me, the structural separation undertaking is one of those unusual documents because it doesn't actually explain how Telstra undertake to structurally separate. It undertakes to explain how they don't need to because they're really nice people and you can trust them anyway. That's rather like trying to sell 2-minute noodles on the basis that they taste good. The SSU is incredibly important as a document because if it is approved, if it in its current form or modified form is actually approved, it becomes in effect a part of the law. It overrides the ACCC's ability to regulate in the realms in which the undertaking covers the activity of Telstra. It becomes a substitute for current regulatory levers and buttons that the regulator has. So I think the SSU, interestingly, has been turned into a form of blackmail. And let me explain why. It's a strong word, but let me explain what's actually going on here. Something that is interesting is the fact, interesting to me, is the fact that the vote is happening next week on whether Telstra shareholders should approve the Telstra NBN Co deal, the key enabler for building the national broadband network. But the structural service under the SSU is not actually an approved document yet. It's very clear from both the initial reactions of the regulator and the initial reactions of industry, pointing out in very clear legal terms why it's not yet compliant, that that document would have to be changed in order to be accepted. This leaves a rather unusual situation. Once the shareholders have voted for the current SSU as part of the process of going forward, because that's all they can vote for is the current one on the table. Telstra has said to its shareholders that they consider that SSU to be sufficient, that they consider it covers all the bases. And putting aside minor modifications that aren't particularly germane, that perhaps they will actually finesse past it in the process, imagine a world where they had to submit a massively modified SSU in order to get by. They would have to go back to shareholders again to get that reasserted. So why bother now when the current SSU is so uncertain? And for me, it's actually about a very interesting sort of blackmail. And let me explain what I mean. It's about the paradox of what the ACCC exists to promote, which is not my interests, not Telstra's interests, it's all of our interests, using a particularly interesting phrase called the long-term interest of end users. So their overall mission is to make sure that end users are advantaged by a competitive situation, whatever that means, and to have that advantage matter more than individual advantages to service providers. So here's the question, is the NBN existing at all worth more or less than Telstra being able to remonopolise the copper terrain while we're all waiting for the NBN to come? Is it better to have an NBN and a decimated competitive environment than to not have the NBN and have the copper environment working better? The future or the past? It's a really interesting question. So again, think about this in the context of the current flawed structural services undertaking and the pressure that would go onto the regulator because the shareholder vote passes, the regulator will be the last barrier to the NBN existing, if and only if they decide to accept that flawed undertaking. Otherwise, we have to go round this merry-go-round again. The Telstra board have the authority for the current undertaking, not for a modified one. They would have to go back to shareholders. I think that's unlikely. They could go back to shareholders, but here's the piece of poker. That process takes many months to go around that cycle. 6, 8, 9 months at least. I don't think the current government really want the network to wait another 6 to 9 months. It's already behind. So there's this pressure that will rise on the current federal government, increasing their existing challenges to whether they can get enough network built before the next election to have enough real human beings buying services from people like us that will actually vote for the retention of this network by voting for the retention of that government. There are these very kind of high-stakes pieces of poker going on here, and I find them kind of intriguing to play with. I'm a spectator, but I would claim obviously an interested one in how this works. So here's what I'd change about the current environment in order to improve the things I've mentioned. So if I had a magic wand, what is it what I would do with that magic wand if I was that particularly unattractive fairy? Not surprisingly, I would love to see that 121 POI decision reversed, and I think it's technically quite easy to reverse. NBN Co are clearly still going to build a network back to those 14 POIs. They need it for command and control. That last few thousand kilometres of copper is a rounding error on their build budget. They're funded to build it anyway. So the network will exist in a form that will allow a change of mind about forcing providers out to those extended connection points. When NBN first proposed the network, they in fact were being Switzerland. They proposed a composite model. You could connect at those 14 POIs, or you could connect deeper with no change in cost. So they're still building that network, so it would be nice to see that happen. Hey, I can dream. I'd also like, not surprisingly, to see the regulator do something much more active about the price of access to the copper network for data, not just for voice. So I would love to see the ACCC move aside from the SSU, which they think will be sufficient to deal with the pricing issues of the copper network, and I don't agree, and instead to actually declare, in other words, to set the price and access conditions for access to wholesale ADSL. Importantly, I think they need to set the price for the bundle of wholesale ADSL and wholesale voice, and that's because that is the structure the NBN uses, and unless they're actually aligned, you get a whole lot of interesting disparities that turn up. And here's the thing. Because we have the NBN going to all of this effort to build a completely new national network, we actually know, for people hundreds of people employed to get this right, what it costs to build a new national network in Australia. According to the NBN Co's public business plan, it costs $33 a customer plus GST as a national average to build and operate this network. That is sufficient to build it, to pay the government back, and to earn a regulated return on investment. So rationally, if the regulator declared a price for that bundle to allow people to have competitive access at the same price as the NBN on the copper today, you would use that as a ceiling price on the copper network and say that $33 for the bundle of telephone rental and broadband and the aggregation circuits to bring them back, because that includes all of that in the NBN numbers. As part of the structural separation undertaking, Telstra published a sample rate card of what they think are reasonable prices to charge in the modern world. Their sample is about twice that much. So they are proposing to charge twice as much as the NBN per customer to connect to the network. That's with today's written down copper network, switches you're having trouble getting spare parts for because they're so old. This is written down assets. Telstra will make out like bandits at NBN prices. They make out like amazing bandits at twice that price, but that's their proposition. When you add their proposed line rental price, their proposed broadband price, and their proposed aggregation price, you get numbers in the 60s and 70s a month as an access fee. So it's pretty easy to understand what the price should be if I could wave that magic wand. And last, again, as an obvious consequence of what I've said, in my perfect world, you would take that extra $4.7 billion you're paying to make Telstra shareholders feel happy, and as NBN Co, on behalf of us as taxpayers, actually buy something for the money. Buy the copper network. Then at least you have created the choice for any future government to use that copper network as a part of a future solution. You don't have to, but you're mad if you don't give yourself a choice. And failing to do that is not protecting the long-term interests of end users, because it's creating a fly or fail scenario. All fibre all the time or nothing at all. And we know what happens. We don't get nothing at all, we get some other strange compromise. So that seems like a kind of obvious thing to ask for. So in summary, here's my magic wands for making the industry work better this year at least. Reverse the 121 POI decision. Have the regulator actually use some more gumption and define the price of access to the copper regime and make it equal to the price of the NBN regime so that we can actually have a smooth transition and have one that still has a competitive environment by the time we get there. And find a way to change that NBN deal one way or another so that if you're paying all this money on behalf of us as taxpayers to make Telstra play nicely, at least actually own an asset in the process. So my forecast on the NBN, cloudy with a chance of hardball. Thank you very much.